According to the UN World Food Program, hunger affects over 840 million people worldwide. To make matters worse, 1/3 of all the food produced around the world goes to waste, clogging landfills and creating an environmental hazard that's problematic in and of itself. Despite improvements in technology, resources, and supply, getting nourishment to those who desperately need it remains a constant challenge. For decades, our next guests have been facing this challenge head on, working tirelessly to create and implement food programs both here and abroad. Innovator and instigator Robert Egger opened DC Kitchen 24 years ago and helped to serve 26 million meals before bringing the concept to California and opening LA Kitchen earlier this year. And as president of one of the nation's largest food banks, Michael Flood oversees, among other things, the distribution of 60 million pounds of food products to a network of 1,000 agencies and assistance programs throughout Los Angeles County annually. And I want to welcome both of you to Full Frame. Michael, why don't I start with you? Food banks, for those who aren't familiar with them, what are they?
Well, they're a fairly new phenomenon. They really only started in the late 60s and 1970s, when a few individuals saw all this food that you referred to that's being thrown away and thought, we should do something with this food. We should capture this food and get it to hungry people. And that's what started here in the U.S. and has grown through the years to become pretty sophisticated organizations helping millions of people throughout the United States. And that concept now has spread worldwide.
There's been an evolution in it as well, and I want to talk further with you about that in just a minute. But I want to also talk to you. You're a familiar face to me, being in Washington, D.C., and you have this philosophy. It's not just about the food, it's the people. What's your phrase?
Oh, well, I mean, I went out one night and served 4 people in front of the State Department. And there was a long line of people outside in the rain, and it was a great experience, but it was charity. And that's really about the redemption of the giver versus the liberation of the receiver. And I think for many of us in this business, is a sense of like, I want to make sure you're fed, but we got to start to put our heads together to figure out how do we get you out of this line. So that's very much what I'm interested in.
So it's not just the food, it's the people. They should not go to waste.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah, I mean, it is. And we're going to get into this, but there's huge frustration and consternation, and a younger generation in particular is wild about the amount of food we throw away. But I think anybody gets into this and does it for a while, you realize that we're wasting people too. So that idea of food and people are equally important. We try and maximize their value.
And you don't want to just focus on one without looking at the whole total landscape.
Right.
And the total landscape is unique too. I mean, people think about, it's interesting, it was not that long ago there was a piece in the Washington Post where there's a former television news producer, I don't know if the two of you read it, but she talked about going and getting food stamps in her Mercedes and how people were giving her grief about it. But she was like, it was the one thing that was paid off in our life.
Right.
And we didn't want to trade it in and maybe get some money and buy a clunker, although that would be acceptable to be driving around in a clunker. But her story was really kind of emblematic of what's happened here in the United States. She and her husband both had great jobs. Right. They had this house, they bought it. Suddenly the market collapses. The house isn't worth anything. They both lose their jobs, and suddenly they're in dire straits. And when we saw this economic meltdown, both of you are out there on the front lines. What did we see? And I'll start with you, Michael.
Well, we saw a large increase in the demand for food assistance, especially from people just like you're mentioning who were working, and this is the first time they ever faced this type of situation in their life, going to a food pantry, asking for help, or applying for the food stamp program. And the sad thing is those numbers have stayed very high. Since the great meltdown, Great Recession of 2007, 2008, we're still at around 50 million Americans living in households that are what's called food insecure, which means they're making these decisions between, do I pay my rent or do I buy food? Do I pay for prescriptions, medication, or do I buy food? And everyone's predicting, unfortunately, that in the United States, that number is going to remain very high for the foreseeable future.
Let's talk a little bit more about food banks. How has the U.S. and the food bank system here kind of shaped things worldwide, would you say?
Well, it really, since we were founded here, I remember serving on the board of Feeding America several years ago when this decision was made to start the Global Food Banking Network and started as a separate nonprofit venture, because so many people in other countries, initially it was more Europe, Latin America, which is where we've really seen a lot of development of food banks, but now it is worldwide in every continent, coming here and asking, what's going on with this concept? We have food production in our countries. what have you done here that has allowed more people to be fed? So it really is that knowledge base that's been developed here and transferring that out, but transferring it in a way that works for whatever that country, culturally, societally, the government policy comes into place. So food banks have this really unique way of adapting to whatever their local circumstances are and figuring out how it's best way to capture this food, bringing it in and get it out so it benefits people.
Let me talk to you about the landscape, because you've been in this game for so long. And one of the things that I thought was interesting before we started the broadcast that you pointed out was, even when you see an explosion where internet takes off, people assume, wow, this means more jobs, less people going in need.
Right.
And that's not necessarily always the case.
No, in fact, this is what interests me, because there's the immediacy of now, but then there's probability, long term, what's around the corner. And right now, you're seeing talk about the economy's recovering, right? So everybody thinks, okay, it's going to go back the way it was. A, it's not. But B, what you're also seeing is the majority of people are now working for hourly wages. So what you're going to see is a lot of people who have a job, or even two jobs. But the face of hunger in America, if you had to pick a face, it's a single mom who's doing everything right, doing everything she's supposed to, works one job, two, get the kids in childcare, but statistically, she's never going to make it through the end of the month without needing some help, because she's just not making enough for gas, rent, all these, and just even simple things like just a birthday party for the kid or new sneakers for school, whatever. But that's the face of hunger, and it's not going to shrink, because again, what we've replaced is the kind of the agriculture and the industrial age jobs that you've worked for a lifetime, with now people having 6, 7 jobs, and they're piecemealing things. So I think many of us are concerned that the numbers aren't going to go down. And not only that, but the scary part is the food we rely on that is donated from industry is more and more lost profit. And industry is getting more and more sophisticated about the food that they produce, and how inventory controls are making it more and more likely that we're going to see less food coming in and more people in line.
Right. This is how we've adapted, because actually food banks here, and you're seeing this worldwide, have moved to capture more perishable food, more fresh produce and fresh vegetables, because that food is even harder to capture and turn into something. A lot of that food never leaves the farm, never leaves the grower. So that's where there's been tremendous growth in the United States, and which has great nutritional benefits to the people receiving that assistance. But when you think about it, going from sort of packaged and canned food to refrigerated food, now you're thinking about refrigerated trucks, refrigerated warehousing, a cold chain that goes all the way through to ensure that food remains wholesome so it can reach the needy person.
What are some things, both of you have been there in the trenches for a long time, what are some advances that we've seen, and what are some things that when you first entered it, you're still seeing on a daily basis?
Well, I mean, when I came along, I had worked in nightclubs, so I just introduced the idea of a kitchen and this idea of community kitchens, saying, in effect, look, if you're going to get all these random items, you can drop it off at a shelter, which was kind of the model. City Harvest in New York was the first prepared food program that went to restaurants at the end of the night. And of course, as you remember, DC, when I started the DC Central Kitchen, catering was king, man. It was roast beef and shrimp and keep it coming. So it was almost, as long as you could wake up at 2 in the morning, you could get tons of amazing food. But this idea of taking what might be a steamship round of beef, for example, instead of just dropping that off at a shelter and having 50 people get a whole bunch of meat, you could take it back to a kitchen, teach unemployed people to cook, make something for 150, and then the restaurants that gave you food would have access to entry-level people. When I started the kitchen, it was the beginning of the great food service arc. So food service jobs were increasing 35% over the next 15 years. So it was kind of a big leap to go from the idea of just service to empowerment, and saying, how can we be part of helping people, stabilize their lives, but also get them on a trajectory. And it goes back a little bit to what you were talking about, refrigeration. It's also been interesting to watch the nonprofit sector evolve from the notion of just mere charities to recognizing that we're major businesses. I mean, Mike runs a serious multi-million-dollar a year business. He's a CEO. He's not just, he does good work. But I think for too often, the work we did was minimized. And I think people now recognize that innovation demands a certain level of professionalism and income and resources that in the past they didn't think we merited. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, but you're a CEO of, I mean, there are a lot of people who wouldn't want your job, CEOs. It's a tough business. And the thing is, you don't see huge wins. You see, it's incremental, isn't it?
That's true. And you have this resource issue as opposed to a for-profit company. You're trying to increase sales. We're trying to increase what? Financial contributions, food donations, volunteerism, which is great. It's a fun way to get people engaged, but you're trying to figure out how to put these inputs together and make it all work so it can benefit the community. And the last thing I would mention, and something Robert and I have focused on in different ways, but in similar ways, is focusing on target populations, kids and seniors. Because in the end, an adult, if they aren't fully disabled, their opportunities are greater than if you're a kid or if you're a senior. Very difficult to tell a senior, well, go out and get a job, right?
Right.
Not necessarily a possibility for most seniors. And for kids, many stuck in their situation, and the best thing they can get is a good education at that point. So that's another thing that's occurred in the food bank world, is developing programs and figuring out how we can deliver not just food, but nutrition, education, and other services to these two vulnerable populations.
I've talked to so many people, Bill Gates, and Howard Buffett, and all of them saying, we've got to look at this. We've been doing things a certain way for so long.
Right.
We got to turn it upside down. And that's really what you're saying in many respects.
I would challenge them. I mean, they're still embracing the Carnegie Rockefeller model, which says, make as much money as you can in your life, and near the end, give some back, trying to offset the damage you did, making a bunch of money in your life. And they're still, with all due respect, they're still pitching that idea of make billions and then give it back. And I think what you're seeing is a younger generation says, not for me, man. I want the way I make my money to be my philanthropy, not the check I write at the end of the year. And that is a bold step forward.
That's interesting. What's your take on that, though, in terms of looking at it one way through a prism and kind of attacking it? Obviously, you're talking about the evolution and the changes that you've seen in the business in terms of your business for a while.
Well, I think we'd like to be, as opposed to, we feel like we're swimming upstream. I mentioned earlier about 34 million Americans food insecure before the Great Recession, now at 50 million. Why didn't we go from 34 million down to 20 million? So we feel like we're constantly, dealing with a larger group of people seeking assistance. That's the economy running well. The people in our lines, they want to be self-sufficient. They don't want to be there getting a bag of food, right? They want to be able to get a well-paying job and not have to worry about food pantries, food banks, the food stamp program, or whatever the case may be. The vast majority of people who we deal with. So really, you mentioned earlier, what's the frustrating part? The frustrating part is we're not getting any help, especially from an economy standpoint. Some of the trends that Robert was talking about, where hourly wages are, where hours are, where benefits are, that's where we really could use some help, because we'd love to be able to close this gap and focus on other things. Maybe look at worldwide problems or look at a different issue. I would love to be able to do that. But to me, that's a frustrating part. We need a better working economy so many people who are in assistance and in need can get out of it, because that's what they'd like to do.
Well, we're gonna have to leave it at that. Both of you, thanks so much for coming in and for the work you do.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Next, the global hunger epidemic and the growing obesity epidemic may have a connection that will surprise you.